It's an editorial instead of just a straight reporting piece, but I think this goes in a good direction. And the title is Talk About Psychedelic Dispensaries. Several psychedelics are making their way through the regulatory process created by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for new drugs. The FDA model, psychedelics are unlikely to be prescribed for consumption at home. Rather, patients will likely have to access psychedelics as part of a therapeutic protocol and consume the medicine under the guidance of medical professionals. One of the goals of this model, called psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, is to create a safe environment for psychedelic use. States that have legalized access to psychedelics have mostly taken this approach. The problem has increased in salience as psychedelic advocacy and cultural acceptance has gained momentum across the country over the last 5 years. There's been ongoing tension between efforts to decriminalize possession and cultivation of psychedelics and efforts to regulate psychedelics. I'm familiar? Decriminalization efforts have made enforcement of state drug laws criminalizing psychedelics the lowest level of law enforcement priority in dozens of states. In 2 states that have legalized access to psychedelics through ballot initiatives, efforts to regulate have mostly won out. In Oregon, ballot measure 109 passed in 2020, giving the Oregon Health Authority the power to regulate psilocybin services, an exclusively on-site consumption model, which is also called supported adult use. In contrast, Colorado's Natural Medicine Health Act, which passed in 2022, has both a regulated on-site consumption model and a decriminalization of personal possession and social sharing model. Under the law, Coloradans may eventually be able to access 4 substances: psilocybin, dimethyltryptamine, ibogaine, and mescaline at state-regulated healing centers guided by state-licensed facilitators. Shortly after the law passed, Coloradans gained the right to cultivate for personal possession and socially share these substances for non-commercial purposes. The law also allows individuals to be paid for providing therapeutic, harm reduction, or other support services related to the sharing or donating of psychedelic substances. Unlike cannabis, where consumers and patients buy a regulated product from dispensaries that must be used off-site, psychedelic proposals mirror FDA's approach by regulating centers where individuals may only access psychedelics on-site. By the decriminalization of possession, the Colorado law does not create a way for residents to purchase regulated psychedelics for use at home. In fact, requiring on-site consumption of legal psychedelics has impeded access considerably by producing long wait lists and increasing the cost dramatically. Due to the extended length of time of many experiences, the thousands of dollars it can cost per session can be mostly attributed to compensating the facilitators. Creating dispensaries would address these pressing issues and further the state's interest in promoting public health by allowing interested consumers to access safely the substances they want. In addition, creating a legal access point for psychedelics would remove a barrier for victims of abuse to report, since the substances could be accessed legally. Dispensaries could also create an additional potential revenue source from the activity that is already occurring. This additional revenue could help fund psychedelic regulation and address the issue of funding, which has already come up in Oregon. But this proposal is not without challenges. As long as psychedelics remain illegal at the federal level, even if certain formulations are rescheduled with FDA approval, limitations on taxes and banking will continue to frustrate the success of state-regulated psychedelic access models. There's also no official federal policy of non-enforcement, as exists in the case of medical cannabis. Set and setting, a term commonly used in the psychedelic ecosystem to describe the impact on the patient's psychedelic experience of both the setting where the medicine is consumed and the mental set of the patient, also poses questions for the dispensary model. If we create psychedelic dispensaries, it may become more difficult to ensure that individuals will use these substances safely. But analysis of psychedelic policy should acknowledge that people are already using these substances. Criminalizing or limiting access to these substances does not mean that people will not use them. It will just make their use less safe. I think this points out something that's very interesting, and I saw this also happen with the cannabis model. You know, when the medical use model came out, all of us were struck with these crazy chronic illnesses that we needed to access cannabis for. When the recreational model came to California, almost everybody was spontaneously healed. And I've always had a bit of an issue with people, though I know it's a legal workaround, always posing people who use cannabis or psychedelics as patients. A lot of us are doing it recreationally. Might want to call it spiritually. I don't like to put those kind of trips on other people. I call it recreationally, right? We need to look at this. There should be, in my estimation, there should be 2 tracks. There should be a clinical track for people who have trauma, early childhood abuse, all types of PTSD. There should be a track for that. There should also be a track for people who just want to contact and explore their consciousness and get a deeper connection with nature. I think this story points to maybe a possibility of a way forward with this. And I'm really interested what you, my fellow correspondents, have to say and what folks in the chat have to say. Matthew St. Germain on a Monday for the High at Night News. Get away, guys.
Psychedelic dispensaries. I mean,
oh yeah,
that shit sounds very interesting. I mean,
do you think they should have like actual, educated folks rather than like bud tenders at these dispensaries?
I think they need to have a warning later, right at the stairwell when you walk in that says "Don't trip."
the reason we don't have knowledgeable bud tenders is because of our current capitalist service model.
Agreed.
Most dispensaries are based off the McDonald's model, where you pay people the absolute minimum. But what you end up getting is somebody with really no experience. You get a young kid who may smoke a little weed, but number one, they have barely any experience in life at all, barely any experience with weed, and they don't have the money to access the majority of the products being sold at the dispensary. The way around having non-knowledgeable bud tenders, pay people who are qualified an actual living wage. I know that sounds crazy and super revolutionary, but it would solve the problem in one day. That being said, yes, Rico, I do think that people should be knowledgeable if they are dispensing psychedelics. I think there are more possibilities of things going wrong if are not properly informed on how to do.
Yeah, and I don't mean that to disparage like anybody either. There are some very, very, very knowledgeable bud tenders out there, so I apologize.
There are a few. There's some kids who really have a lot of passion for it, but I see the same thing all the time. I go into dispensaries just to kind of keep abreast of what's going on in the legal market, and the number one thing that happens when I start pointing to stuff on the shelves and asking people, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? They're like, bro, I can't afford that. Because I'm usually looking at the better quality flower, and they're just like, dude, like, so that's a $60 jar plus $30 of tax. That's a $90 jar, bro. I'm $17 an hour.
Well, that's a failure of the brand, though, because the brand should be sampling those bud tenders precisely for that reason.
Yeah.
I think so. And when I've worked in retail sales in cannabis, I've always advocated for big giveaways. It's how you move the needle.
Yeah, and we used to give away product and, come in and do education for the bud tenders. We're getting off track, but what would end up happening invariably almost all the time is that the buyers and the store owners would take all the free stuff and the bud tenders would never see it. I mean, that happened a lot. But going back to this, should there be psychedelic dispensaries? I think I wouldn't label them dispensaries. But I think if I were I've never tripped. Like, I've done microdosing a ton, but I've literally never gone on a big trip because it's scary to me. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how I'm going to feel. I've never done acid. So I'm just one of those people where I would want someone there to guide the experience. So if it were more of a guide as opposed to a bud tender kind of situation, then I would be down for it. And I don't know if you need to call it a clinic or what you need to call it, a safe space to trip or a rocket ship or something.
A rocket ship.
Yeah, or a rabbit hole, whatever. But I wouldn't call it a dispensary first and foremost. And second of all, yeah, it needs to be somebody who would make me feel supremely at ease to even going down that experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
I agree, and I think a lot of people do need that. I would like to see personally something more along the line of a non-religious, non-denominational church type model where there's a large hall, there's some pillows, there's blankets, there's comfortable seats, there's some water, there's a nice bathroom, there's volunteers that are willing to sit with folks through these experiences. Maybe we do it on a Sunday, maybe we do it on a Saturday. One of the biggest issues with having folks sit with you is that it restricts psychedelic access to people with a lot of money, because most qualified sitters aren't going to sit down and spend this time for under $40-50 an hour. And when you look at LSD having a 10 to 14 hour duration, you know what I mean? You're talking about hundreds to thousands of dollars per trip. In the medical model, we could get to a point where the FDA will actually, and the FDA will okay it, and insurance companies, would pay for that trip sitting in that facility. But then you could have a broader amount of open access to more people. But when it comes to a non-medical model, I really feel like psychedelics need to have a different track, or non-profit organization. Well, as psychedelic navigators need to help.
You were talking about that there's this misconception that people are always using psychedelics for medical reasons, but you're saying a lot of people use them recreationally. And so then you need to have a dual system, because if that's the case,
I agree.
That addresses everybody.
I agree 100%.
Yeah, I mean,
yes.
The only thing about dual systems, and I'm just here to disagree a little bit and keep it lively and chop it up. The only thing about dual systems is we're talking about dual bureaucracies, dual costs, dual regulatory tracks. And there is this argument that the line between wellness and medicine, between improving oneself through new experiential opportunities versus having specific traumas that are covered, is I just often feel that it invites the government to come in and overregulate and micromanage. And we've covered states where they were talking about a medical cannabis program, but they weren't initially going to cover AIDS. And we railed upon how crazy that was, that lawmakers who were not doctors were sitting there with their pencil and their checklist and deciding what medical ailments qualified for medical cannabis use. And I think the conversation, at least for cannabis, has expanded to understand that there's a very, very fine line between wellness and medicine. And for everybody, that might be a slightly different line. And so I just wonder out loud whether with psychedelics, whether there could be a singular regulatory pathway that would allow these things to not be felonies, even in modest amounts, where we create some guardrails and some safety systems so that people aren't tripping balls and jumping off bridges because they think they can fly, and where it might be for PTSD, or it might be because they like that band Fish. I mean, who am I to say?
Mm-hmm. I'd like to just say this. I'd like to stop right now. I'd like to invite everybody here to stop this whole taking acid and jumping off a building to think I can fly thing. That is a lie.
Yeah.
And it's a lie promulgated by the CIA. Based on a guy named Frank Underwood.
Frank Underwood?
Underwood. Correct.
Frank Underwood.
He worked for the U.S. Department of Defense creating biochemical warfare agents and mind control agents. When he developed a conscience and wanted to jump. I'm forgetting the name of the laboratory, but it'll come to me. When he caught a conscience and wanted to expose the program, his fellow CIA agents dosed him with LSD, which caused him jump out a window. Although most likely was pushed out the window. You guys, there's no actual proof of anybody being with him or not. And the newspapers came up with this story, this cover story of he jumped out of a window thinking. It's not true. Additionally, Art Linkletter's daughter committed suicide, and Art Linkletter was one of the main people responsible for the legalization of LSD. He was an alcoholic. She had an uncaring dad. She had an abundance of problems. She took LSD one time and then killed herself a month later. And Art Linkletter, instead of looking at his own failed parenting, went on The Tonight Show, The Dick Cavett Show, and basically any media he could to blame LSD and work with President Nixon to to illegalize LSD because of his failure as a parent. There's all these stories that have been pushed forth as memes in our media that are meant to demonize these substances, because these substances at their base level are to do these in nature quietly with a supportive group around you, people that you feel safe with. What you are going to find is you're going to be connected with nature at a deeper level and to see a fuller truth of who you are and who we are, which is a human family on a spaceship called Earth. All right, give me one more second. You're going to start to be far less controllable when you realize a deeper version of who you are, and you can get past the fear of your ego and the death of your ego. You become less controllable. That is why psychedelics were made illegal, because it created a huge generation of Americans that for a moment were not afraid and were calling for the end of war and for the end of fascism in America. Take it away, Yarrow.
All right. It is not a lie. I sat there at Reggae on the River. I watched somebody who was on mushrooms jump off the rocks into the water and kill themselves on accident while everybody was encouraging them to jump from a height that was too tall. I lost a friend who walked out into the freeway in the Emerald Triangle and got hit by cars because he was on LSD. Okay? This has nothing to do with the CIA.
I've never heard of those stories.
Theory. Of course not. But these are I witnessed this.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And these are second degree stories that are recent. They're not historic. They're not conspiracy theories. And so the risk profile for psychedelics is worth being incredibly reverent about and trying to figure out how we get this right. And so it's one thing for a 13-year-old to get into their dad's Canagar stash and to end up eating all the Ben and Jerry's and sitting there with their eyes off their head watching infomercials at 2:30 a.m. And it is a very different thing to have psychedelics and to try to figure out how we balance the need for decriminalization versus the access. I love you because you are evangelical about the benefits, and watching somebody jump off of rocks while they were on mushrooms and kill themselves, and watching them be removed from a concert while I was simultaneously on mushrooms myself, forever changed my relationship with psychedelics, because while I understood the deep, deep teachings that I could experience if I opened my mind and allowed my creativity to be on octane booster, I also saw that in nature and in those uncontrolled environments where there weren't those spiritual Sherpas, that without a guide, this could be really, really dangerous. And I will tell you, my friend Ethan, who died because he walked out into a freeway, was not a young guy. He was not a teenager. He wasn't his first time. This was a man in his late 30s, early 40s. And it happens, and it happened, and it could happen again.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know,
there's always a chance that things will go wrong with any substance, but according to your logic, we should then also restrict access to cars, because kids can grab your keys to car and kill themselves. No one should have a gun in their house. No one should have alcohol in their house. No one should have Tylenol in their house.
Cars require a license. Guns you sometimes require license.
And
cars require training. Yeah, so
you're supposed to be over 18. Do you have to have a license to pick up a pair of keys in your your parents' house? No, you don't. So there's this constant need
to
nerf the world and make the world safe. It's completely impossible, and it goes again to people's ego death and their fear of dying and wanting to give away their power to other people so somebody can name them as a safe person. You are now safe. There's no guns in your house. You can't even open the door without having a chaperone to go outside, because everything outside could kill you. We're going to take you in a bubble to the store and buy only things that you can. Oh, wait, you can't even buy food because you can literally drink too much water or eat too much food and die. So we're going to feed you by an IV and keep you tied down, and you're going to be safe. But guess what? An asteroid could hit the planet and kill all of us any moment. A super volcano could go off in Yellowstone and destroy all of us. I think it's far more important to people how to be educated, responsible, sovereign self-navigators of this world than to try to think you can nerf the world. And again, if you think that kids should not be able to access psychedelics, I agree with that. And you think that the way to do that is then to illegalize them. You also have to make cars illegal. You have to make guns illegal. You have to make alcohol illegal, because I know kids who have died alcohol abuse, just binge drinking. So I have to say I strongly disagree, but I also respect your perspective at the same time that I disagree with you.
It reminds me of, like, I just got back from 2 months in Europe, and what I can tell you just was really salient to me is that we do nerf everything in America, and in Europe they take a completely different approach to everything. So I was in Italy and I went to jump off these rocks into the water, and it was treacherous. I had to have shoes on. The rocks were sharp. There was no handrail. Like, I had to climb down, and this was a resort area. And in the resort information, they're like, people like to jump off the rocks into the Mediterranean over in this one part, and there's a little map to it. And I had to climb down a rock, get onto this thing. It was super slippery and sharp. And I thought, this would never fly in America, because imagine if somebody slipped and fell and cut themselves, that resort would get sued and it'd be a wrap. And in Europe, they kind of have the mentality of, you're a grown-ass person, take responsibility for yourself, make your choices. If you want to eat too much, you're going to get fat. If you want to climb on these rocks and jump in the water, you might get cut, or you might get hurt, whatever those things are. So I think the interesting thing is we're fighting for legalization of all of these substances. And I know, Yarrow, that you're, playing devil's advocate, and people can get hurt. And part of the adult decision I've made not to trip isn't that I've got any experience watching someone lose their life, but I'm careful with what I do to my brain, because I value it and I want to have it function going on into the future. I've made the adult decision not to trip, but that was my decision to make. And I am in a world where everybody I know trips balls all the time. So I like the option of having access as an adult to the things that I want to do, and have the government trust me to make a good decision for myself. right? So the person that unfortunately jumped off those rocks, there was a whole bunch of other stuff going on. Were there other substances, peer pressure, jump, all that stuff? You can see
there was jump, and there was also a lot of gravity involved.
Well,
I mean, it just, I don't know. I just think we got to take responsibility for our decisions, and government needs to give us that option.
You're so right about this nerf mentality, right? Because at the end of the day, there are so many dangerous things. There are so many choice points that we have on a daily basis about what to do to be safe and to preserve our physicality and our well-being. I am not an advocate that these things should be criminalized or that people should get a felony for having a gram of mushrooms in their pocket. I just think the notion of regulation is a lot more complicated than cannabis. And while we're still using a highly regulated adult use model that comes originally from alcohol and then has been perfected and expanded with cannabis to some degree, I just think that psychedelics offer greater complexity. I completely agree with what you said, Matthew, in respects to this idea that we can't have a nanny state. And Jamie, when you're saying that about that jump off point at the resort, I'm thinking about how opposite the United States is, where you can't even go to Half Dome in Yosemite without all of these obvious signs saying, hey, there's a big cliff right there. You might fall and it's going to hurt a little bit. So you guys are absolutely correct in that regard. And I totally concur.
Well, I'll tell you what. I know somebody that the police were knocking on their door and they were high on mushrooms, and they jumped off their second-story balcony and tried to commit suicide because they didn't want to go back to Men's Central Jail. And I know of another instance that happened in the Bay Area back in the day when we all used to go to raves, and they had one rave that was on the Red and White Fleet one year. Okay. And they only had this rave once, and they never had it again because there was someone that got too high on the boat and literally jumped off into the bay, and then his friend jumped off, tried to save him, and they both died.
God.
Well, there's something called the Darwin Award, because there's a lot of people who have not really been taught or trained or accepted the higher levels of consciousness alive on the planet. Again, I know a ton of people who have done really stupid shit sober, myself included. Never once seen anybody suggest
I remember that time you started
sobriety.
to almost jump in the campfire and light yourself on fire. You remember that?
I did not try to jump in the fire. I did roll around the ground. But anyway, I'd like to say that what I think is that the best way forward for psychedelics is education and information instead of fear. And really the best way if somebody wants to do psychedelics is to find a psychedelic big brother or sister, find a group of people that you can trust that are doing them. That's really the way that they've been primarily done throughout the aeons of humanity. And only these last few decades where they've been demonized and hidden from us and over legislated because they interrupt the current fascist agenda that's being exercised by most governments on the planet. It's created all of these areas of fear. Like what Jamie said, I've never done drugs because I want to be good to my brain. It's the same thing Neil deGrasse Tyson and Michio Kaku say. Two of the smartest guys who have fallen prey to this demonization of psychedelics. When one looks at the actual medical scientific information about psychedelics, they cause neurogenesis. They make your brain regrow axons and neurons. They cause neuroplasticity. They make you pattern and form new, more helpful patterns for your life. One mushroom trip ends depression for a year. They cause increased blood flow to your brain. Increased blood flow is increased oxygenation, which is increased maintenance and cleaning of your brain. Another aspect of neuroplasticity is they make it easier to learn. There's an abundance of trials right now for psychedelics for Parkinson's, ALS, and other neurodegenerative diseases, as well as PTSD and depression. So the thought that you're going to ruin your brain with psychedelics is that's old school drug war propaganda, and it's not actually true. People I know who have really fucked their brains up are the people who did some psychedelics and also were horking down mad amounts of mad amounts of cocaine and drinking ridiculous amounts of alcohol. Cocaine is shown to lead to Parkinson's-like syndromes, and alcohol is a solvent that literally dissolves your brain. So I would say to anybody who wants to have a clean and healthy brain, don't worry about doing psychedelics or not. Definitely stay away from alcohol. Definitely stay away from cocaine.
Well,
I have a call with a doctor.
I have to
jam.
And that I will tell you, I've told lots of people this story. My cousin is the reason that I did the microdose, the very first one. And he said, I was like 2 years beyond my divorce. He said he hadn't seen me smile in 2 years. He said, I'm tired of looking at your fucking face, is what he said to me.
Oh.
And he's like, you're going to do it.
I will never tire of looking at your face.
And he goes, we're going to do this. You're going to take mushrooms. It's going to make you feel better. You're going to feel happy. We're going to laugh. We're going to sit here. We're not going anywhere. But he absolutely required that I do it. And I did it. And it really was like lifting this like dark cloud off my shoulders. It is, I would tell you, what healed my depression from the divorce, all of that. I just have never done a full-blown, like, big-ass trip where I saw the walls melting and stuff like that. That's the thing that I'm, and I don't know if it's propaganda or just, I don't like to do anything to excess. It wouldn't matter what it is, because I like my brain.
High dose psychedelic experiences aren't for most people. In fact, the way it really ran in tribal society was the weirder ones among the tribe would kind of live along the outskirts, and they would be taught in a master apprentice way to use psychedelics. And the majority of the tribe wouldn't use psychedelics. They would go to the curandero, the shaman, the plant priest or priestess, and they would be healed. While the shaman was on the drugs, they would see the other plants this person needed to take. They would sing to them. They would put them in a trance. And so really they never were for everyone to do traditionally.
Yeah,
I think microdosing is a great way to access.
Hey guys, we got
amazing.
We got to keep this.
I got to go too. I got a doctor call. I love everybody.
Doctor call. We love you, Matthew St. Germain. Thank you for being here today. We got to keep